The telegraph wire snapped on January 11, 1887 at 2:47 p.m., 11 miles northeast of Laramie, Wyoming Territory, where the temperature had already dropped to 6 degrees, and the sky held that particular density of grey that anyone who'd survived a Wyoming winter recognized as violence approaching. Margaret Vogel, 42 years old, descended earthen steps into her home 18 feet below ground level, where the air stayed at 58 degrees of, regardless of what hell broke loose above. Thomas Brennan, who owned the Mercantile and had spent 4 months telling anyone who'd listen that the German woman was digging her own grave, watched the telegraph operator's face go white as the connection to Cheyenne died. Margaret had arrived September 3, 1886, with $127 in a leather pouch, 3 months after her husband Frederick had been crushed between freight cars at the Philadelphia rail yard where he'd worked 11 years. She spoke English with an accent thick enough that storekeepers pretended not to understand, and carried grief that showed in the mechanical way she moved. The homestead claim, 160 acres that 3 men had abandoned, sat where Medicine Bow Creek had carved a valley into prairie. She'd grown up in Heidelberg, where her father operated wine cellars carved 30 feet into limestone, and she knew that Earth held its temperature with geological stubbornness, cool in summer, warm in winter. Thomas Brennan was 59, had survived 18 Wyoming winters through caution and contempt for optimists. When she'd asked about timber prices versus excavation costs, he'd looked at her with the patience used on children. "Mom, you're talking about living in a hole. I've seen miners die in collapsed shafts. Earth caves in. It's what Earth does." She'd asked for the excavator's name anyway, and he'd given it while calculating funeral expenses. Dr. Edwin Marshall, 47, had treated 17 consumption cases and understood that damp, poorly ventilated spaces killed people predictably. Mrs. Vogel, atmospheric pressure at depth affects respiration. Moisture accumulates without proper ventilation, creating ideal conditions for pulmonary disease. Reverend Samuel Hartwick, 63, had buried 41 homesteaders during 12 years serving scattered congregations. He'd ridden out with stated purpose of spiritual counsel and actual purpose of talking her out of suicide by architecture. The Lord gives us earth to live upon, not within. I've officiated funerals for folks who thought they could outsmart this territory. Catherine Brennan, Thomas's wife, 44, and practical in ways that came from managing households through disasters, had visited under pretense of bringing preserves. She'd watched Margaret work, the methodical measurements, the calculations, the precision. "I've buried 2 children and seen enough dying to recognize it. I hope your judgment is better than my husband thinks, because he's already planning your funeral." But before we go further, if you're finding value in these frontier survival stories, please subscribe and hit that like button. Drop your city and country in the comments. I'd love to know where you're watching from. She'd grown up where her father, Klaus Brenner, operated wine cellars supplying half of Heidelberg's restaurants. She'd spent childhood 20 to 30 feet below street level, where temperature never varied more than 3 degrees, whether summer scorched cobblestones or winter froze the Neckar River solid. Ground 18 feet below Wyoming Territory's surface stayed at 52 to 56 degree temps year-round, whether air above reached 95 degree temps in July or dropped to negative 40 degree temps in February. This was physics, reliable as gravity. A conventional Wyoming frame house lost heat through every surface. Maintaining 65 degree atmosphere inside when outside temperature dropped to negative 20 degree fires required burning approximately 15 pounds of cordwood per hour, roughly 360 pounds daily, nearly 2 cords weekly during coldest months. At $4.50 per cord, homesteaders faced $18 weekly just avoiding freezing, but Earth 18 feet deep asked almost nothing. Temperature differential between ground and her target 62° forced was only 6 degrees, not the 85-degree difference surface houses fought. She could heat that space with 6 to 8 pounds of wood daily, using 1/20th the fuel surface dwellings required. She'd calculated surviving an entire winter on 3 cords, less than most homesteaders burned in 2 weeks. Excavation began September 27th when John Kessler arrived with 4 horses and a scraper blade modified from railroad grading equipment. He was 53, charged $2.50 daily for work that destroyed most men's backs before 40. Margaret's design called for 22 feet by 16 feet by 18 feet deep, oriented east-west to maximize southern sun exposure. Kessler worked 12 days, and by October 9th, the bottom was 6 degrees cooler than surface, despite October sun. She'd salvaged timber from an abandoned homestead 9 miles east, the Patterson family, who'd given up after locusts destroyed their crop, and the wife died of childbed fever. Main beams were oak, properly cured and pitch-sealed. She hired Daniel and Robert Fisher, Germans from Pennsylvania, who understood timber framing at $1.75 daily each. They spent 8 days constructing roof structure, 4 main beams spanning 16 feet, cross beams every 2 feet, split pine boards creating solid deck. On boards went 18 inches of prairie sod, thick chunks from creek bottom, where root systems had woven decades into something approaching concrete. The entrance faced south, a ramp descending 15 degrees for 12 feet, walls lined with limestone mortared with clay mixed with prairie grass. 6 feet inside, she'd built a second door, creating an airlock preventing heat loss. 2 6-inch diameter stovepipe ventilation pipes ran from interior up through sod roof. Interior walls were lined with pine boards, creating an air gap preventing moisture condensation. The stove was small, barely 2 feet square, positioned center with chimney running through one ventilation pipe. By November 3rd, when overnight temperatures dropped to 14 degrees, she'd moved in completely. Interior temperature sat at 59 degrees, without any fire, just earth, holding steady against chaos above. Catherine Brennan visited November 7th, expecting darkness and damp, and instead found a space that felt like a well-built root cellar, cool but not cold, dry despite being underground. "My God, it's warmer in here than my kitchen." Margaret made coffee using half a pound of wood that would have required 3 pounds in a surface dwelling. John Kessler, who'd excavated the pit, rode out November 19th during a cold snap at Sectoga. He'd found Margaret hanging laundry in a simple wool coat while he was wrapped in buffalo hide and shivering. "How cold is it inside?" 61 degrees. I burned 4 pounds of wood yesterday." He'd done the math. At 2 degrees outside, conventional houses would be burning wood by the armload. I'll be damned. These stories of frontier innovation aren't just history. They're forgotten wisdom that could save lives today. If this resonates with you, please share this video and help preserve this knowledge. Now, back to January 1887, where Margaret was about to face the ultimate test. The blizzard began January 11th at 2:47 p.m. when the telegraph wire snapped. Temperature was 6 degrees Celsius. By midnight, negative 12 degree hour. By dawn, January 12th, negative 28 degree hours with wind speeds at 45 miles per hour, creating wind chill that would freeze exposed flesh in under 3 minutes. The wind came from northwest, carrying snow refrozen into particles hard enough to strip paint and draw blood. Visibility dropped to under 15 feet by 4 p.m. By evening, you couldn't see your hand at arm's length. Temperature dropped 3 to 4 degrees every hour, falling through zero with methodical certainty. Margaret had been preparing since November. She'd stacked 6 cords of cottonwood and oak in a shed 20 feet from her entrance. When the wire snapped, she'd carried 340 pounds of wood down into her space, far more than needed, but enough that she wouldn't have to go outside. She'd filled every container with water from the creek. She'd brought down extra kerosene. She'd even brought down 6 laying hens in a crate near the stove, where they'd stay warm and continue providing eggs while the storm tried to kill everything that breathed. On the surface, the storm began its work with perfected efficiency. Thomas Brennan's Mercantile lost its chimney at 11 p.m. when wind gusts exceeded 60 miles per hour. The chimney, approximately 180 pounds of brick and mortar, came through the roof and crashed through the ceiling where Thomas and Catherine slept, missing Catherine's head by less than 2 feet. Daniel Fisher, who'd helped build Margaret's roof, had stocked 12 cords of wood. The problem wasn't quantity, it was access. He'd stacked wood 60 feet from his cabin because of fire risk, and by 3 a.m. January 12th, when temperature hit negative 31 degrees, those 60 feet might as well have been 60 miles. He'd tried to reach the woodpile at dawn, made it 20 feet before wind knocked him down and frostbite started claiming his left ear and 3 fingers. For the next 19 days, he and his wife Sarah burned furniture, floorboards, and finally cabin walls themselves, trying to stay warm while watching their extremities turn black. Dr. Edwin Marshall, who'd warned Margaret about underground dangers, found his water supply froze solid January 13th and stayed frozen 17 days. The well was 30 feet from his house with sophisticated hand pump he'd installed at considerable expense. Wind made the 30-foot journey impossible, and water in pipes had frozen to ice hard enough that heating risked explosion. He melted snow, burning through wood at a terrifying rate, and by January 20th was rationing fuel. Reverend Hartwick's church, which had stood since 1873, lost its roof January 14th when accumulated snow, driven into drifts weighing several tons, simply crushed the timber framing. The collapse at 2 a.m. sounded like artillery, loud enough to wake families a quarter mile away. The church had been designated emergency shelter, and its destruction left 19 families without backup plan. John Kessler lived in a dugout carved into hillside, a hybrid structure, half underground. His structure survived better than most, but January 16th, his stove chimney cracked from thermal stress, metal contracting in negative 35-degree off air. He had to choose between heat and breathable air. He chose air, spending next 12 days huddled under buffalo robes in space that never got above 38-degree active. But worst was the Morrison family, Robert and Ellen, 34 and 31, with 4 children aged 2 to 9. Their cabin was well constructed, chinked properly, with good stove and enough firewood to last until March. On January 15th, their 6-year-old daughter Hannah developed fever reaching 104 degrees Fahrenheit by evening. Ellen recognized scarlet fever and knew the child needed fluids, rest, careful temperature monitoring. What the child didn't need was a room fluctuating between 50 degrees when fire died and 78 degrees when they stoked it desperately. By January 17th, Hannah was having seizures. By January 19th, she was dead, and Robert Morrison stood outside in negative 22-degree weather with a pickaxe, trying to break ground frozen harder than granite, trying to dig a grave while his wife sat inside holding a body cooling to match ambient temperature. Margaret, 18 feet underground, experienced the storm as mathematical validation. January 11th, interior temperature was 61 degrees Fahrenheit. By January 12th, with surface at negative 28 degrees, her interior had dropped to 59 degrees, a 2-degree decline requiring approximately 3 pounds of wood to restore to 62 degrees. She burned it not because she was cold, but to test calculations. They held perfectly. 3 pounds, burned slowly over 4 hours, raised temperature 3 degrees, and held it 11 hours. By January 14th, when families on surface burned furniture and prayed for the storm to end, Margaret sat at her cottonwood table reading by candlelight, occasionally adding a single piece of wood, comfortable in wool dress without needing a shawl. Interior temperature never dropped below 57 degrees, even when she let fire go out completely. Earth simply held its temperature with patience, predating mammals. But January 16th, Margaret faced her own crisis, not from storm, but from biology. She was 3 months pregnant. Frederick had been dead 8 months, but their last night together had been productive in ways neither anticipated. Pregnancy had been progressing normally until January 16th, when she began experiencing cramping she recognized immediately as miscarriage beginning. Pain started 4 a.m., dull and rhythmic, and by noon had intensified to where she couldn't stand without gripping furniture. She was alone, 18 feet underground, in space keeping her perfectly warm, but unable to help with biological process, trying to expel a pregnancy her body decided couldn't continue. She had water, she had warmth, she had shelter. What she didn't have was access to Dr. Marshall or medical supplies that might have helped manage bleeding starting in earnest January 17th. For 3 days, January 16th through 19th, while storm continued and families on surface fought their own battles, Margaret lay in her bed managing miscarriage in space that stayed 58 to 62 degrees, regardless of how much blood she lost or how weak she became. Earth didn't care about her pain, it just maintained temperature. She kept stove burning low, added wood when she had strength, let it go out when she didn't. Temperature never fluctuated more than 4 degrees. She survived because the space required so little from her. The storm ended February 1st, 21 days after it began. Wind simply stopped screaming and temperature climbed to 12 degrees, which felt tropical after 3 weeks of negative readings. Snow depth ranged from 4 to 11 feet. The telegraph line stayed down until February 9th, when Laramie learned the storm had killed 47 people across Wyoming Territory, plus uncounted livestock. Thomas Brennan was among first to check on Margaret February the 2nd, expecting to find at minimum a desperate woman, at maximum a body proving he'd been right. What he found was a woman in a clean dress, looking thin and tired but fundamentally healthy, standing in doorway, exhaling air warm enough to fog in 12-degree morning. His house was damaged. His business had lost thousands in burned inventory. His hands bore frostbite marks. And here was this woman looking at him with tired patience. "Mr. Brennan, would you like to come inside? I have coffee." They descended, and Thomas Brennan stood in space that stayed 60 degrees and understood what he'd been too proud to see. "Mrs. Vogel, I was wrong about this." The words came out stiff, like something that hurt to speak, but he said them anyway. "I need to understand how this works." She'd explained patiently the thermal mass, the calculations, the principles that had worked in Heidelberg and worked here. She'd shown him her notebook with mathematics, the ventilation system, the airlock design. When he left 2 hours later, he was already planning how to incorporate earth sheltering into the new house he'd have to build to replace the one the storm had damaged. By following summer, 7 families had built variations on Margaretta's design. Dr. Marshall, who'd warned her about underground dangers, published an article in the Wyoming Territorial Medical Journal documenting that families in earth-sheltered homes had experienced 73% fewer respiratory infections during the 1887 winter compared to surface dwellings. He'd included temperature data, fuel consumption records, and a formal apology for his initial skepticism. By 1889, similar designs appeared from Bozeman to Missoula, and engineers from the Colorado School of Mines began studying the principles, finding parallels with Norse turf houses, Native American pit dwellings, and medieval European root cellars. The innovation wasn't new, it was ancient, rediscovered by necessity. Margaret lived another 37 years, eventually marrying John Kessler in 1890, and raising 2 sons who grew up in the underground home and never quite understood why surface dwellers complained about Wyoming winters. When she died in 1924 at 79, her obituary in the Laramie Boomerang mentioned her church work, her gardening, her kindness to neighbors. It didn't mention the innovation that had saved dozens of lives and changed how frontier families approached survival. The technology had become invisible through success. In 2019, archaeology students from University of Wyoming discovered her original structure while surveying historic homesteads. The roof had collapsed decades ago, but the excavation remained, 22 feet by 16 feet by 18 feet deep, precisely as she'd planned. Temperature readings taken at 18 feet showed 54 degrees in July and 53 degrees in January. The Earth was still doing what Earth does, holding steady against chaos above. The principles work because they're based on physics, not fashion. Thermal mass doesn't care about century or culture. Earth's capacity to buffer temperature extremes is measured in millions of years, not decades. The question isn't whether it worked. The question is why we forgot. Perhaps because Margaret's solution required patience, waiting for Earth to do its work rather than fighting it with fire and fuel. Perhaps because it required humility, accepting that nature's systems, refined over geological time, might be more reliable than human engineering. Perhaps because it required observing what worked, rather than assuming we already knew. The frontier isn't just history. It's a laboratory where people solved problems with limited resources and stakes measured in survival. Their solutions weren't primitive. They were precise, tested by conditions that punished mistakes with death and rewarded innovation with life. We'd do well to remember that before we dismiss wisdom as outdated simply because it's old. If this story moved you, if it made you think about what we've lost in our rush toward modern solutions, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel. Share this video. These stories matter. This knowledge matters. And somewhere out there, someone needs to hear that the wisdom everyone dismissed might be exactly what saves them. Drop your city and country in the comments. Let's build a community that remembers what the frontier knew. Because Margaret Vogel didn't just survive the winter of 1887. She proved that sometimes the deepest wisdom comes from going underground, from working with Earth instead of against it, from trusting physics over pride. And that's a lesson worth remembering, whether you're facing a Wyoming blizzard or just trying to figure out how to live better with less.